My name is Hassan. I'm 38 years old from Syria. On March 17th, 2017, I died for 20 minutes during combat near Aleppo. I was a respected Imam who had memorized the entire Quran by age 15. I believed Jesus was only a prophet, nothing more. What happened in those 20 minutes shattered everything I thought I knew about God. The war in Syria had been raging for 6 brutal years when I made the decision that would change my eternal destiny. As an imam in our small village outside Aleppo, I had watched helplessly as foreign forces tore apart the country I loved. Every Friday, I stood before my congregation and preached about the righteousness of defending our faith, our families, and our homeland against the infidels who sought to destroy Islam. I wasn't just a religious leader offering empty words from behind the pulpit. When the fighting reached our region, I felt Allah calling me to take action. At 38 years old, I had spent my entire adult life in peaceful religious study and teaching. I could recite the entire Quran from memory, having completed it by age 15. I led prayers 5 times daily, counseled troubled families, and was respected throughout our community as a man of deep faith and wisdom. But watching the destruction around us, I became convinced that passive prayer wasn't enough. The Western coalition was bombing Muslim civilians, and I believed with absolute certainty that Allah was calling faithful men to defend Islam through jihad. This wasn't terrorism in my mind. This was righteous warfare sanctioned by God Himself against those who sought to destroy our way of life. I volunteered for combat duty with a group of local fighters who had organized to defend our villages. These weren't extremist radicals. They were ordinary men, fathers and brothers and sons who felt called to protect their families from foreign invasion. I saw myself as their spiritual guide, the one who would keep them connected to Allah's will even in the chaos of warfare. Every morning, before we went out on patrol or engaged in combat operations, I would lead our group in prayer. I taught them the proper way to recite the Shahada if death seemed imminent. La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammadun Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His messenger. I genuinely believed that any of us who died fighting in this cause would be immediately transported to Jannah, paradise, where we would be rewarded with eternal bliss. The theology seemed crystal clear to me. The Quran promised that those who died in jihad would bypass the normal judgment process and go directly to paradise. I had memorized Surah 3169 and never think of those who have been killed in the cause of Allah as dead. Rather, they are alive with their Lord, receiving provision. This wasn't just academic knowledge for me. This was the bedrock certainty that allowed me to face combat without fear. March 17th, 2017 started like many other days during those months of fighting. I woke before dawn for Fajr prayer, then prepared my weapon and equipment while reciting verses from the Quran. The plan was to defend a strategic position near the eastern outskirts of Aleppo that government forces were trying to retake. Our intelligence suggested that enemy troops would attempt to advance through our sector sometime that morning. The landscape around Aleppo had been transformed into something from a nightmare. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Streets where children had once played were now filled with concrete debris, twisted metal, and the lingering smell of explosives. The ancient minaret of the great mosque, where I had dreamed of preaching someday, had been reduced to a pile of stones. But despite the devastation, I felt a sense of divine purpose that morning. I was exactly where Allah wanted me to be, doing exactly what He had called me to do. As we took our positions behind concrete barriers and in the ruins of destroyed buildings, I felt the same peace I experienced during deep prayer. This was worship through action, service to Allah through sacrifice. The attack began around 10 in the morning with distant artillery fire that gradually moved closer to our position. The sound of incoming shells creates a terror that's impossible to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It starts as a whistle in the distance, then grows to a screaming roar that seems to fill your entire consciousness. You never know if the next shell has your name on it. As the enemy forces advanced, small arms fire erupted all around us. Bullets cracked overhead like deadly insects, chipping concrete and sending up clouds of dust wherever they struck. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of men trying to coordinate their defense under impossible conditions. I had positioned myself near the center of our line, where I could encourage the other fighters and offer spiritual guidance if anyone was wounded. Combat isn't like the movies, it's mostly chaos, confusion, and terror, punctuated by brief moments of clarity when you actually see what you're supposed to shoot at. In the middle of the firefight, I saw one of our younger fighters, barely 19 years old, huddled behind cover, with terror written across his face. I crawled over to him, keeping low to avoid the bullets whistling overhead. "Remember why you're here, brother," I told him. "This is Allah's work. If we die today, we die as martyrs." Those words were still on my lips when I heard the incoming mortar shell. The whistle was different this time, closer, more direct. I had just enough time to whisper the beginning of the Shahada under my breath, "La ilaha illallah. There is no God but Allah." The explosion occurred about 20 feet from our position, but the shrapnel traveled much farther. I felt the hot metal tear through my chest and abdomen like the claws of some invisible beast. The impact threw me backward against a concrete wall, and immediately I could taste blood filling my mouth and throat. I looked down at my body and saw wounds that I knew were fatal. Blood was pouring from multiple punctures in my chest, and I could feel my strength draining away like water from a broken container. My legs wouldn't respond when I tried to move them, and breathing became a conscious struggle rather than an automatic function. In what I knew were my final moments of life, I felt an overwhelming sense of completion. I was dying exactly as I had always hoped to die, in service to Allah, fighting for the cause of Islam. As my vision began to tunnel and darkness crept in from the edges, I tried to complete the Shahada. Wa Muhammadun Rasul Allah. And Muhammad is his messenger. My heart stopped beating as those words formed in my mind, and Hassan, the Imam, died believing he was about to meet Allah as a faithful martyr who had earned his place in paradise through righteous warfare. The next thing I experienced defied everything I thought I understood about death and the afterlife. One moment I was dying on that rubble-strewn street in Aleppo, blood filling my lungs and darkness closing in around my vision. The next moment I was floating 15 feet above the battlefield, looking down at my own lifeless body with perfect clarity and no pain whatsoever. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced while living. I was fully conscious, more aware and alert than I had ever been, but completely detached from the physical form that lay motionless below me. From this elevated perspective, I could see the entire scope of the battle raging around my corpse with a clarity that had been impossible while crouched behind concrete barriers. My body looked smaller than I had imagined, crumpled against the concrete wall where the explosion had thrown me. Blood had pooled around my chest and was seeping into the dust-covered ground. My eyes were open but seeing nothing, staring blankly at the smoke-filled sky above the battlefield. The wounds in my torso were massive, clearly fatal, with shrapnel protruding from several locations. I watched as my comrades realized what had happened. Ahmed, the young fighter I had been encouraging just moments before, was the first to reach my position. He dropped his rifle and crawled quickly across the open ground, despite the bullets still flying overhead. When he reached me, he immediately checked for a pulse in my neck, then placed his ear against my chest, listening for a heartbeat that was no longer there. "Hassan!" he shouted over the noise of continued gunfire. "Hassan, can you hear me?" But I could see that he already knew the answer. My chest wasn't rising and falling with breath. My skin was rapidly losing color, and my eyes had the fixed, dilated stare that every combat veteran recognizes as death. Two other fighters, Ibrahim and Khalil, managed to reach my position and help Ahmed drag my body behind better cover. I could hear every word they spoke, even though the battle was still raging around them with deafening intensity. Their voice carried a mixture of grief, shock, and the practical concern of soldiers who had seen death many times before but never expected to lose their spiritual leader. "How long has he been down?" Ibrahim asked, checking my wrist for any sign of pulse. "Maybe 5 minutes since the mortar hit," Ahmed replied, his voice breaking with emotion. "He was talking to me when it happened. He was telling me about martyrdom, about dying for Allah's cause." Khalil, who was older and had more medical training than the others, examined my wounds with grim efficiency. "These are fatal injuries," he said quietly. "Even if we could get him to a hospital right now, which we can't, there's nothing anyone could do." The shrapnel went straight through his heart and lungs. I wanted desperately to tell them I was right there, floating just above them, that I hadn't really gone anywhere. I tried to shout, to somehow communicate that my consciousness was still present and aware, but I had no voice, no physical form to manipulate, no way to interact with the material world I was observing. The strangest thing was how I felt about watching my own death. I expected to feel sadness, fear, or regret, but instead I experienced an odd sense of detachment, as if I was watching something that was happening to someone else. The pain that had overwhelmed me in my final living moments was completely gone, replaced by a weightless peace that felt almost like floating in warm water. Ahmed began reciting prayers over my body, verses from the Quran that were traditionally spoken for the dead. "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un," he whispered. "Indeed we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return." The familiar Arabic words that I had recited over so many others during my years as an Imam now seemed strange and distant when spoken over my own corpse. But as I listened to these Islamic funeral rites being performed below me, I began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was experiencing. According to everything I had been taught about Islamic eschatology, the moment of death should have brought immediate contact with the angels of the grave, Munkar and Nakir, who would question me about my faith and deeds. I had spent years teaching others about this process. Upon death, a Muslim's soul should be visited by these examining angels who would ask 3 crucial questions. Who is your Lord? What is your religion? Who is your prophet? Based on the answers, the soul would either be comforted until the day of judgment, or punished in the grave for insufficient faith. But there were no angels approaching me, no divine interrogation beginning, no sense of being transported toward the Islamic paradise I had expected to earn through martyrdom. Instead, I was simply floating in a kind of spiritual limbo, observing my physical death while remaining mysteriously conscious and aware. The absence of everything I had been promised was more disturbing than any punishment would have been. I had died exactly as Islamic theology promised would guarantee immediate paradise, fighting jihad in defense of the faith, with the shahada on my lips, sacrificing my life for Allah's cause. Yet instead of being welcomed into Jannah by beautiful houris and flowing rivers, I was experiencing something that didn't match any of the descriptions I had memorized from the Quran and Hadith. As minutes passed, my comrades made the practical decision that combat soldiers have to make. They couldn't stay with my body any longer without risking their own lives. The enemy forces were advancing, and they needed to fall back to secondary positions. Ahmed said a final prayer over me, asking Allah to receive my soul as a martyr. Then they abandoned my corpse to continue fighting. Watching them leave was strangely heartbreaking. Even though I understood the military necessity, my physical form was just dead meat now, but some part of me still felt attached to it, reluctant to see it left alone on that desolate battlefield among the concrete rubble and twisted metal. Ask yourself this question: what would you feel if everything you had believed about death and the afterlife turned out to be completely wrong? What would go through your mind if you died expecting one thing and found yourself experiencing something entirely different? That's exactly where I found myself as I floated above my own corpse in the ruins of Aleppo. Every certainty I had built my life upon, every promise I had been taught to expect, every reward I thought I had earned through righteous warfare, simply wasn't materializing. Instead of the Islamic paradise I had been promised, I was entering into something I had never been prepared for. As the sounds of battle gradually moved farther away from my position, I felt myself being drawn upward and away from the scene. Some invisible force was beginning to pull me away from my physical body, away from the battlefield, away from everything I had known as earthly reality. The last thing I saw was my own blood-stained face lying in the Syrian dust, I staring sightlessly at nothing, while my consciousness was transported into whatever comes after death for those who thought they knew exactly what to expect. The Islamic Imam who had died believing he understood God's will was about to discover that truth was bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than anything he had ever imagined. I was drawn through what felt like an endless cosmic void, moving at impossible speeds through dimensions that had no physical reference points. The sensation was completely unlike anything described in Islamic eschatology. There were no bridges over hell, no scales weighing my deeds, no angels escorting me toward judgment. Instead, I found myself traveling through a darkness so complete it made the blackest night seem bright by comparison. But this wasn't the terrifying darkness of punishment or torment. It felt more like a transition, a passage between one state of existence and another. I was fully conscious during this journey, more aware and alert than I had ever been while living, but I had no physical form to speak of. I existed as pure consciousness, thought without flesh, awareness without body. As I moved through this cosmic emptiness, I began to reflect on what should have been happening according to everything I had been taught, Islamic theology was specific about the afterlife process. The moment a Muslim dies, especially a martyr who dies in jihad, the soul should be immediately visited by angels who would either comfort or interrogate, depending on the person's faithfulness during life. I had memorized countless hadith about martyrdom. The Prophet Muhammad had promised that martyrs would have their sins forgiven at the moment of death, that they would bypass the normal waiting period in the grave, and that they would be immediately welcomed into the highest levels of paradise. I had taught these promises to others for years, using them to comfort grieving families and to encourage young men to sacrifice their lives for Allah's cause. But as I traveled deeper into this cosmic void, none of those familiar promises were materializing. There was no immediate transport to paradise, no greeting from the Prophet Muhammad, no presentation before Allah's throne for reward and recognition. Instead, I found myself alone, in a silence so profound it seemed to press against my consciousness like a weight. The silence wasn't empty, though. It was full of opportunity for reflection, for examining my life and beliefs without the distractions of physical existence. In that perfect quiet, away from all earthly noise and influence, I began to honestly assess who I had been and what I had really believed during my 38 years of life. I thought about my childhood, raised in a devoutly Muslim family where religious observance was not optional but mandatory. I had learned to recite Arabic prayers before I could properly read my native language. By age 10, I was waking before dawn for Fajr prayers, fasting during Ramadan despite my young age, and memorizing Quranic verses with the intensity that other children applied to games and sports. My path to becoming an Imam had seemed inevitable from early childhood. Teachers at the local mosque praised my quick memorization and deep dedication to Islamic study. My parents were proud that their son showed such promise as a religious leader. By 15, when I completed memorizing the entire Quran, the community was already looking to me as a future spiritual guide. But in that cosmic darkness, stripped of all pride and pretense, I began to see my religious devotion from a different perspective. Had I really loved Allah, or had I loved the respect and authority that came with being a religious leader? Had my dedication to Islamic law been motivated by genuine faith or by the social status it provided in my community? I remember the harsh judgments I had passed on those who didn't meet Islamic standards, the way I had condemned Christians as polytheists for believing in the Trinity, calling them mushrikun, idol worshippers who had corrupted the original message of Jesus. I had taught that their belief in Jesus as the Son of God was blasphemy of the highest order, an unforgivable sin that would send them to eternal hellfire. The irony was sharp and painful. I had spent years teaching others about the dangers of shirk, the Islamic concept of associating partners with Allah, while completely missing the possibility that my own understanding of God might be incomplete. My certainty about Christian error had been absolute, built on years of Quranic study and the Islamic theology that left no room for doubt about the superiority of Islam over all other religions. In that place of perfect honesty, I also had to confront the times when I had felt spiritually empty despite all my religious activity. There had been moments during my years as an Imam when the 5 daily prayers felt mechanical rather than meaningful, when the Arabic words I recited seemed to bounce off the ceiling rather than reach heaven, when I wondered if anyone was actually listening to the countless supplications I offered. I had always pushed these doubts aside, attributing them to Satan's whispers or to my own spiritual weakness. Islamic teaching provided ready explanations for any feelings of spiritual dryness. Increase your prayers, give more charity, read more Quran, fast more often. The solution to spiritual emptiness was always more religious activity, never the possibility that the entire framework might be inadequate. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself honestly, have you ever felt spiritually empty despite sincere religious devotion? Have you ever wondered if your prayers were reaching anyone? If your faith was connecting you to actual divine presence? Or if you were simply going through motions that provided comfort but no real spiritual power? That's exactly what I was confronting in this place beyond physical existence. Despite decades of Islamic devotion, despite memorizing the entire Quran, despite leading prayers and teaching others about faith, I felt spiritually impoverished. All my religious knowledge and practice had not produced the deep connection with God that my soul craved. The darkness around me wasn't malevolent or punishing. It was simply revealing the truth about my spiritual condition. All the external religious observances that had defined my identity as an Imam hadn't actually satisfied the deepest needs of my heart. I had been religiously active but spiritually malnourished, knowledgeable about the Islamic doctrine but disconnected from the divine presence I claimed to serve. This realization was both humbling and terrifying. If Islam, which I had believed to be the final and perfect revelation from Allah, hadn't provided what my soul was searching for, then what would? If martyrdom in jihad, which Islamic teaching promised would guarantee immediate paradise, had instead led me to this place of cosmic questioning, then what did that say about everything I had built my life upon? The silence continued, but it wasn't passive. It was expectant, as if something was waiting for me to reach the end of my own understanding, to exhaust my own explanations and justifications, to become ready for truth that couldn't be contained within the Islamic framework I had known. In that moment of complete spiritual bankruptcy, when I had been forced to admit that all my religious devotion had left me empty and all my theological certainty had proven inadequate, I became ready to encounter something that would challenge every assumption I had ever held about God, about reality, about the true nature of spiritual existence. The darkness was preparing me for light, but not the light I had expected or been taught to anticipate. What was coming would be bigger than Islam, bigger than any religion I had known, bigger than any human conception of the divine. And I was about to discover that the God I had served so devotedly for 38 years was himself pointing toward a truth that I had spent my entire religious career rejecting. From the depths of that cosmic darkness, a single point of light appeared so distant it might have been a star seen from billions of miles away. But the moment I perceived it, I knew this wasn't ordinary light. This illumination carried something I had never experienced in all my years of Islamic devotion, the presence of pure unconditional love radiating across infinite space directly toward me. The light began to grow larger and brighter, but not in any way that hurt or overwhelmed me. Instead, it seemed to adjust its intensity to exactly what I could bear, revealing more of its glory. As my consciousness became capable of receiving it, as it approached, I felt every part of my being drawn toward it, with a magnetism that was irresistible yet completely voluntary. This wasn't compulsion. This was the most natural attraction I had ever experienced, like a flower turning toward the sun or a child running toward a loving parent. The warmth reached me before the full brightness did, penetrating through every aspect of my consciousness with a healing that went deeper than anything physical. This wasn't just the absence of cold, this was the positive presence of comfort that seemed to melt away layers of bitterness, anger, and the spiritual emptiness that I hadn't even realized were weighing me down. Years of religious striving, years of trying to earn Allah's favor through perfect observance, years of judging others and myself by impossible standards, all began dissolving in the presence of this overwhelming love. As the light drew closer, I could see that it wasn't merely illumination in any ordinary sense. This light was alive, conscious, purposeful. It pulsed with intelligence and intention that made every human thought seem like a whisper compared to a symphony. This was the source of all light, all love, all existence itself, and it was coming directly toward me despite everything I had done to reject it throughout my life. My first instinct was to hide, to somehow retreat from this perfect purity that exposed every flaw in my character with surgical precision. I had spent 38 years building an identity as a righteous man, an Imam worthy of respect and honor. But in the presence of this absolute holiness, I could see myself as I really was: proud, judgmental, spiritually empty, despite all my religious activity, motivated more by the desire for human approval than by genuine love for God. But even as I wanted to flee from this overwhelming purity, some deeper part of my consciousness was crying out with recognition and longing. This presence represented everything I had been searching for through all my prayers, all my fasting, all my religious study. This was the divine connection my soul had been craving despite years of Islamic devotion that had left me spiritually malnourished. The brilliance continued to grow until it filled my entire field of awareness, but strangely, the more intense it became, the more comfortable I felt in its presence. It was as if this light was transforming me even as I observed it, preparing me to receive revelations that would have been impossible in my previous spiritual condition. Then, in the center of that magnificent radiance, a figure began to take shape. I knew who it was before any words were spoken, and the recognition hit me like a lightning bolt of terror and wonder. This was Jesus of Nazareth, standing before me in a form that transcended every artistic representation I had ever seen. But this wasn't the limited prophet I had been taught about in Islamic theology. This was someone infinitely greater, carrying the weight of eternity in his presence, but also a gentleness that made me want to weep for all the time I had wasted running from him. His appearance defied description in human language. His face shone with a light that seemed to come from within, not reflected from any external source. His eyes held depths of love and wisdom that made me feel as though every moment of my life was simultaneously known and cherished by him. His hands, when I could bear to look at them, still carried the scars of crucifixion, but those wounds were not sources of pain. They were fountains of light, pouring out the very love that was transforming my consciousness. When he spoke my name, his voice didn't come from vocal cords or sound waves. It seemed to arise from within my own consciousness while simultaneously surrounding me from every direction. "Hassan," he said, and that single word carried more love than I had received from every human relationship in my life combined. I have been with you your entire life. Those words shattered every theological framework I had built my identity upon. Always. Not from some future moment when I might convert to Christianity. Not from the time when I might acknowledge him as anything more than a prophet, but always throughout every prayer I had offered to Allah, throughout every verse of the Quran I had memorized, throughout every moment when I had been actively denying his divinity. He had been present, loving me, protecting me, drawing me toward this inevitable encounter. The impossibility of it overwhelmed me completely. I tried to respond with the only framework I knew. You are Isa ibn Maryam, the prophet honored in the Quran. I protested, desperately clinging to the Islamic teaching that had defined my entire worldview. You are one of the great messengers sent by Allah, but you cannot be his son. But Jesus simply smiled with an expression of infinite patience, the way a loving teacher might smile at a confused student who was finally ready to learn the truth. Hassan, he replied gently, I am more than what you were taught. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Those words, which I had heard Christians quote, and had always dismissed as blasphemous corruption, now rang with the authority of absolute truth. Standing in his presence, I could no longer deny what every fiber of my being was recognizing. This wasn't just a prophet or messenger or a created being. This was the eternal Son of God, the second person of the Trinity I had spent years teaching others to reject as impossible polytheism. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything I had believed about the nature of God, everything I had taught about the impossibility of divine incarnation, everything I had built my identity upon as a Muslim leader was crumbling in real time. But as it crumbled, something beautiful was taking its place. The recognition that I was in the presence of perfect love, love so pure and complete that it could embrace even someone who had spent his life as its enemy. Hassan, Jesus continued, his voice full of compassion for my confusion, when you prayed 5 times daily facing Mecca, I heard every word and loved you for your sincere seeking. When you studied the Quran, searching for spiritual truth, I was guiding your heart toward this moment when you would finally see me clearly. Every moment of genuine worship in your life, even when directed through imperfect understanding, was reaching me. Then he began to show me something that completed my theological transformation. I saw the crucifixion not as a historical event from 2000 years ago, but as a living, eternal reality that existed outside of time. I watched as he willingly submitted to torture and death, taking upon himself every sin I had ever committed, every harsh judgment I had passed on others, every moment of spiritual pride that had separated me from God's love. Light poured from his wounds, and I understood with perfect clarity that this was the sacrifice that had covered my failures, the atonement that had made it possible for a holy God to embrace a sinful man like me. This wasn't the false crucifixion that Islamic teaching claimed. This was the ultimate expression of divine love. God himself paying the price for human rebellion so that creatures like me could be reconciled to their creator. Hassan, he said, as understanding flooded through my consciousness, I died for you even when you denied my divinity. I rose from the dead to prove that death has no power over those who trust in me. And now I offer you the choice that every human being must make. Will you receive the love that has always been yours? Or will you continue trying to earn through religious works what can only be accepted as a gift. For the first time in my life, I felt loved without conditions, without performance, without the need to maintain religious appearances or meet impossible standards. This was the divine acceptance my soul had been crying out for through all those years of Islamic striving, and it was offered freely, not because I deserved it, but because love himself had paid the price to make it possible. In that moment, every barrier between my heart and God dissolved completely, and I knew that I belonged to Jesus Christ forever, as the full reality of Jesus' identity settled into my consciousness. He began to show me moments from my life that I had never seen from his perspective. This wasn't the harsh judgment I might have expected from the Allah I had tried to serve through rigid religious observance. This was gentle revelation, truth shared with the patience of a loving father, helping his child understand something wonderful. I watched myself as a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, kneeling beside my bed in earnest prayer. I remembered that night clearly. I had been struggling with doubts about whether Allah really heard my prayers, whether He cared about a small boy's concerns about school, friends, and family problems. I had poured out my heart in desperate Arabic supplications, begging for some sign that my words were reaching heaven. But now, seeing that scene through Jesus' eyes, I could see what I had missed as a child. He had been there in that room, listening to every word, loving me for my sincere heart even when my theological understanding was incomplete. The peace that had eventually settled over my young spirit that night hadn't come from Allah as a distant deity. It had come from Jesus himself, responding to the genuine cry of a child's heart. When you sought Allah in your most honest moments, Jesus explained gently, you were actually seeking me. Every true prayer, every sincere spiritual longing, every moment when you genuinely reached out for divine connection, I was there responding to your heart even when your mind didn't understand who I was. He showed me my teenage years when I had thrown myself into Islamic study with passionate intensity. I watched myself memorizing Quranic verses late into the night, sacrificing sleep and social activities to master Arabic pronunciation and Islamic jurisprudence. I had believed I was earning Allah's approval through this dedicated scholarship, building up credit in heaven through my religious achievements. But Jesus revealed something that transformed my understanding of those years completely. Hassan, every moment you spent seeking truth, even through imperfect religious frameworks, was precious to me. Your hunger for spiritual reality, your willingness to sacrifice for what you believed was divine truth, your sincere desire to live righteously, all of that was my spirit drawing you toward this encounter we're having now. The revelation was staggering. My Islamic devotion hadn't been wasted effort or misdirected energy. It had been preparation, a process by which Jesus had been cultivating in my heart the spiritual hunger that would eventually lead me to recognize Him when we finally met face to face. Every prayer toward Mecca had been heard by Him. Every verse of the Quran I had memorized had somehow been used by Him to prepare my heart for ultimate truth. Then He began to show me the moments when I had felt most spiritually empty despite my religious success. I watched myself as a young Imam leading Friday prayers for hundreds of worshippers while feeling completely disconnected from the God I was supposed to represent. I saw myself reciting Arabic liturgy that had become mechanical rather than meaningful, going through religious motions that brought human approval but no genuine spiritual satisfaction. Those moments of emptiness weren't evidence of your spiritual failure, Jesus said with infinite compassion. They were my spirit within you, crying out for the relationship I had always intended us to have. Your heart was too big for religion, Hassan. It was designed for relationship with me. But perhaps the most powerful revelation came when he showed me my years as an anti-Christian teacher. I watched myself standing before groups of young Muslim men, passionately explaining why Christian beliefs were corruption of original divine truth. I saw myself ridiculing the Trinity as impossible polytheism, dismissing the crucifixion as a lie invented by Paul, teaching that Christians were kafir, unbelievers destined for hellfire unless they converted to Islam. I expected Jesus to show disappointment or anger about these years when I had actively worked against him. Instead, his response filled me with wonder and broke my heart with its tenderness. Hassan, he said, even when you were teaching against me, I loved you. I could see your sincere heart, your genuine desire to serve God faithfully according to the best understanding you had been given. Your passion for truth, even when misdirected, was beautiful to me. I knew that someday I would be able to redirect that same passion toward proclaiming my real identity to those who are trapped in the same deception you escaped. Then came the moment that completed my transformation forever. Jesus showed me the crucifixion not as a historical event I could analyze or debate, but as living eternal reality that existed outside the boundaries of time and space. I saw him hanging on that Roman cross, and I understood with perfect clarity that he wasn't there as a victim of political circumstance or religious persecution. He was there voluntarily, paying a price for human rebellion that only God himself could pay. But this wasn't the remote theological concept I had always dismissed. I could see myself there. My pride, my religious self-righteousness, my harsh judgments of others, my spiritual emptiness disguised as religious success, all of it was being absorbed into his body as he hung between heaven and earth. Every sin I had ever committed, every failure I had ever tried to hide, every moment when I had fallen short of what God created me to be, all of it was being taken away from me and placed on him. Light poured from his wounds, not the light of mere illumination, but the light of love so pure it could transform the darkest human heart. I understood in that moment that this was why no amount of religious work could earn salvation. The debt human rebellion had created was too massive for any creature to pay. Only the Creator himself could settle it, and he had done exactly that. Hassan, Jesus said as these revelations flooded through my consciousness, this is why I told my disciples that I am the only way to the Father, not because I wanted to exclude sincere seekers like you, but because I am the only bridge strong enough to cross the chasm that sin creates between holy God and fallen humanity. Then came the moment I had been unconsciously dreading, the choice that would determine not just my eternity, but the remainder of whatever earthly life might be given back to me. You have a decision to make, Jesus said, his voice carrying both infinite love and perfect respect for my freedom to choose. You can stay here with me now, enter into the rest and joy you were created for, and leave behind forever the struggle and pain of earthly existence. Your mother and father are here, waiting to welcome you into paradise that exceeds anything described in the Quran. The thought of seeing my parents again, of being able to embrace them and share this incredible discovery was almost irresistible. But then Jesus presented the alternative. Or you can return to your body, back to a world that will reject you for this truth you've discovered, back to friends and family who will consider you an apostate deserving death. You can go back to tell others what you've seen here, knowing that most will not believe you and many will hate you for it. I looked into his eyes and I could see that he already knew what my choice would be, but he wanted me to make it freely and completely. If you return, he continued, your life will never be easy. You will lose friends, be rejected by family, face persecution from the religious authorities you once served. But your testimony will save many who are trapped in the same deception you escaped. Look into your own heart right now and imagine facing that choice. Would you choose immediate, perfect peace with Jesus, or would you accept the pain of returning to a world that would hate you for telling the truth? What would motivate someone to voluntarily leave paradise in order to face persecution? The answer came from somewhere deeper than rational thought. Looking at Jesus, seeing the love in his eyes, understanding the sacrifice he had made to reach even someone like me, I knew I couldn't keep this discovery to myself. Lord, I said, tears of joy and surrender flowing down my spiritual face, if you can use someone who spent years denying your divinity, someone who taught others to reject your sacrifice, then send me back. Let me tell them what I've seen. Let me show them that you're waiting for them too, no matter what religion they were born into. Jesus smiled with approval that warmed me to my core, and I knew I was about to return to a life that would be completely different from the one I had left behind on that Syrian battlefield. The moment I made my choice to return, Jesus placed his scarred hand on my forehead and said words that I will carry with me for eternity. Go back, my son. Tell them I'm waiting for them too. Suddenly I was being pulled backward through dimensions I couldn't comprehend, rushing away from that perfect light back toward the broken world I had left behind. The sensation was like being compressed from infinite space into a small damaged container, and when I slammed back into my physical body, the pain was overwhelming. I gasped like a drowning man breaking the surface of water after 20 minutes underwater. My lungs burned as they suddenly remembered how to process oxygen. My heart kicked back into rhythm with such violence that it felt like an explosion in my chest, and every nerve in my body screamed with the agony of returning to flesh that had been clinically dead for far too long. The Syrian medics who had been preparing to transport my corpse to a morgue literally jumped backward in shock. I later learned that one of them, a Christian named Maroon, who had been secretly praying over my body, fell to his knees weeping when my eyes suddenly opened and I began breathing again. But the first words out of my mouth weren't in Arabic. They were the name that had become the center of my entire existence: Jesus. Jesus is real. Jesus is Lord. The medical team stared at me in confusion and terror. According to everything they knew about battlefield medicine, 20 minutes without pulse or respiration meant irreversible brain death. Yet here I was, not only alive, but speaking coherently about the very person whose divinity Islamic teaching specifically denies. They assumed I was hallucinating from oxygen deprivation, that my brain had been damaged by the extended cardiac arrest. But I knew with absolute certainty that what I had experienced was more real than the physical world I was returning to. The presence of Jesus was still with me, not as a memory, but as a living reality. Something fundamental had changed in my consciousness. The spiritual emptiness that had plagued me throughout years of Islamic devotion was gone, replaced by a peace and joy that seemed to radiate from the core of my being. Recovery in the Syrian military hospital was long and complicated. The shrapnel wounds in my chest required multiple surgeries, and doctors repeatedly expressed amazement that I had survived injuries they considered fatal. But even more puzzling to them was my complete transformation in personality and belief. The respected Imam, who had volunteered for jihad, had returned as someone entirely different. The moment I was able to speak clearly, I began telling everyone who would listen about my encounter with Jesus. The nurses, orderlies, doctors, other patients, anyone within earshot heard my testimony. I couldn't contain what had happened to me. The love I had experienced, the truth I had discovered, the person I had met, all of it poured out of me like water from a broken dam. My fellow fighters were the first to visit, and their reaction was a preview of what I would face for the rest of my life. Ahmed, the young man I had been encouraging just before the mortar explosion, sat by my bedside with tears streaming down his face. "Hassan," he said, "what happened to you? You're talking about Jesus like he's God himself. Have you lost your mind?" I looked at him with compassion I had never felt before. "Ahmed," I said gently, 3 months ago I would have said exactly the same thing to someone in my position. I know how this sounds to you, but I'm asking you to consider something. What if everything we were taught about Jesus was incomplete? What if he really is who he claimed to be?" His response was immediate and devastating. "You're speaking blasphemy, Hassan. You're committing shirk, the unforgivable sin. If the religious authorities hear you talking like this, they'll declare you an apostate." He left that day and never returned, and I later learned he had warned others in our unit to stay away from me because my injuries had clearly caused permanent brain damage. But I understood his reaction because I remembered being exactly where he was. The cognitive dissonance of hearing a respected Islamic scholar declare faith in Jesus as the Son of God was too much for his worldview to process. It was easier to believe I had suffered psychological trauma than to consider that fundamental Islamic teachings might be incomplete. Within weeks, word of my conversion had spread throughout our religious community. Former colleagues who had respected me as an imam began avoiding me entirely. The mosque where I had led prayers for years issued a formal statement declaring that I had fallen into kufr, unbelief, and warning Muslims not to listen to my corrupted teaching. My own family's reaction was perhaps the most painful. My brother Rashid, who had always looked up to me as a spiritual leader, came to the hospital with tears of rage in his eyes. "You have brought shame on our family name," he said. "Our father is rolling in his grave. How can you betray everything we taught you, everything you taught others?" I tried to explain what had happened during those 20 minutes of death, but he wouldn't listen. "Hassan," he said with finality, "according to Islamic law, you are an apostate. You deserve death for this betrayal of Allah and His Messenger. Don't contact our family again until you come to your senses and return to Islam." That conversation broke my heart, but it couldn't touch the joy that Jesus had planted in my core. Losing human relationships was painful, but I had gained a relationship with God Himself that transcended any earthly connection. As Jesus had warned me, following Him would cost me everything I had valued in my whole life, but what I received in return was infinitely more precious than what I lost. As soon as I was physically able, I began secretly studying the Bible with the same intensity I had once brought to Quranic memorization. Every page confirmed what I had experienced during my encounter with Jesus. The Gospels read like eyewitness accounts of the same person I had met in that place beyond death. His words, his character, his claims to divinity, all of it matched perfectly with what I had experienced firsthand. The most dramatic change was in my prayer life. For 38 years, I had prayed 5 times daily in Arabic, following ritual formulas that had become mechanical and empty. Now, when I prayed to Jesus in my native tongue, speaking to him as naturally as I would talk to a friend sitting beside me, I felt his presence responding immediately. Prayer had transformed from religious obligation into personal conversation with someone who loved me unconditionally. Within a year, I felt called to begin sharing my testimony more formally. I started secretly meeting with other Muslims who had questions about Christianity, telling them about my journey from Islam to faith in Jesus. The response was remarkable. Many had felt the same spiritual emptiness I had experienced despite years of Islamic devotion, and my story gave them permission to consider that there might be more to Jesus than they had been taught. But this ministry also brought danger. Several times, religious authorities attempted to have me arrested for apostasy. I received death threats from former colleagues who considered my conversion a betrayal worthy of execution. I was forced to move frequently, always looking over my shoulder, never knowing when someone might decide to enforce Islamic law's death penalty for those who leave the faith. Yet none of this persecution could diminish the joy of knowing Jesus personally. Every threat, every rejection, every moment of danger was overshadowed by the reality of his presence in my life. I had found what my soul had been searching for through all those years of religious striving, and no human opposition could take that away from me. Now ask yourself, why would a respected Imam risk losing everything unless what he experienced was absolutely real? Why would someone with every reason to maintain his position in Islamic leadership voluntarily become an outcast and target for persecution? What would motivate someone to abandon the religion he had devoted his entire life to unless he had encountered truth so compelling it made every sacrifice worthwhile? 7 years have passed since I died on that Syrian battlefield and met Jesus face to face. I've shared my testimony with thousands of Muslims across the Middle East and beyond, always at personal risk, always knowing that each conversation might result in violent retaliation. Some believe and find the same salvation I discovered. Others react with the same angry rejection I once would have shown to someone making these claims. But I continue sharing this story because I cannot forget the love in Jesus' eyes when he looked at me, a man who had spent years denying his divinity. I cannot forget his words. Tell them I'm waiting for them too. He wasn't just speaking about Christians or people from Christian backgrounds. He was speaking about Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, everyone who has ever lived and died without knowing the depth of God's love for them. Look inside your own heart right now. Have you felt that same spiritual emptiness I experienced despite religious devotion? Have you wondered if there's more to existence than the religious framework you inherited? Truth is not found in fear of questioning or rigid adherence to tradition. Truth is found in surrendering to perfect love, even when that love comes from an unexpected source. I died in war thinking I was serving God through violence and rigid religious observance. But Jesus showed me that God is love, and His service is loving others with the same unconditional acceptance He has shown to us. What I thought was martyrdom for Allah was actually God's way of bringing me face to face with His Son, the one I had unknowingly been seeking through all my years of Islamic prayer. The Hassan who died believing Jesus was just a prophet will never return. I live now as someone who belongs to Jesus Christ forever, and I spend every remaining day of my life telling others that He's waiting for them too, regardless of what religion they were born into or what they've been taught about Him.